Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. Today's episode will be a discussion of a figure that we've all heard of many times, but probably few of us, including myself, know a great deal about in detail. Pope St. Gregory the Great, of course, one of the great forefathers of the Western Church and a doctor of the Church. For me, his name is associated with the Gregorian chant, but also with his writings on the lives of the saints and St. Benedict. I've read his life of St. Benedict, which is well worth picking up. But I really didn't know too much about Pope St. Gregory's life until I read this new biography, or I should say a new translation of a biography originally written in German called In the Eye of the Storm, a biography of Gregory the Great, newly published by Ignatius Press. And to discuss the book, I have with me here the translator of this from German into English, Chase Faucheux. Welcome to the show, Chase.
Hey, thank you very much.
Presumably, this author has some kind of repute for them to want to translate her work from German into English, but it's not someone I've heard of before. Is this a well-known biographer of saints or something? Can you tell me anything about Sigrid Grabner, who wrote the book in German?
I don't actually know very much about her, to tell you the truth. I got the assignment from Ignatius. They had the manuscript that they wanted translated. But from what I know, she has written other biographies. I can't remember if she has written about other saints. I'd have to go back and check that. I know she's written a book.
I saw that she wrote about Gandhi.
Gandhi, yes, that's what I was going to say. Yeah, she's written about him. And I think from what I can tell, she had at least some kind of connections in the Vatican when Benedict was Pope, I believe. But or at least she had spent a lot of time in Rome during that period. And so much of this book actually grew out of her experience in Rome. If you read the introduction to the book, she writes about how what actually led her to write this book was that she had been spending a lot of time in Rome at that time. And she kept being drawn back to the church of San Gregorio Magno, which is St. Gregory the Great. It's on the Caelian Hill, which is where he grew up, where he had his monastery and all that stuff. And over the years, she kept being drawn back to this church, drawn back to the images of Gregory that were at the church, at the chapels that were set up near his home and all that kind of stuff. And that is what eventually brought her to take this deep dive into his life. Yeah.
Well, okay, so it's interesting. I'm in a sort of like online great books program right now. It's not like an accredited institution. It's just something for learning, not for, for documentation. But it's we've been reading some ancient histories, Herodotus, Thucydides, and now we just read some lives from Plutarch. Mm-hmm. And we're going to be getting into some of the ancient Roman histories.
Yes.
And so it's really interesting right after reading a bunch of Plutarch's lives to then read this book, which is a whole different period of Roman history. Right. And yet it seems to me one that any student of ancient Rome should not neglect. And certainly they shouldn't only, if you're doing a great books approach, you shouldn't only approach it through the eyes of Gibbons either, who had a particular interpretation of the role of Christianity and the downfall of the Roman Empire. So this was a very fascinating period to learn more about in such detail. Could you give us an overview of the situation of the Roman Empire and the Roman city at the time that Gregory was coming of age?
Sure. I think the biggest misconception that most of us have living as we do in a period that frames the Roman world the way it does is we assume that the Roman Empire fell. Often the date is 476, which is when the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. But that would have been news to anybody at the time. Nobody at the time. The Western Empire was certainly in complete disarray, completely crumbling all over the place. But the Eastern Empire, which was the Roman Empire, and Constantinople had been the capital since, I think, I forget what year it was that Constantine built it, but it had been for a long time, and this is the Roman world. But what had been happening in the 2 centuries that preceded Gregory's life is just that, especially the western part of the empire was just under constant, just constant turmoil that were coming from.
This is in the 500s, right?
Yeah, the 4 and the 500s, really. So the first sacking of Rome, which was the first sack of Rome in 800 years. So remember, the city had been unconquered for almost a millennium at this point. Was Alaric and the Goths that sacked the city. And after that, the city got sacked. I forget how many times. It was just several times. I mean, every couple of decades, the city was getting sacked. And each time, the city and the surrounding countryside was damaged to a degree that it could no longer sustain the population that it had before. So by the time Gregory was living there, so Rome at its height, I think in the middle imperial period, had something like over 1 million residents, which was gigantic for an ancient city. Rome at the time of Gregory was much, much diminished. It was much smaller, both in size, in population, and in its importance. Even in terms of political importance, Rome was less important in the Western world than Ravenna was. Ravenna actually has access to the Adriatic Sea, and so it's much easier to communicate with Constantinople. But Rome had very strong symbolic importance, both historic and its Christian importance, because that was the city of Peter and Paul. That was why for the Christian church, Rome was seen as just very important. That was where the bodies of Paul and Peter were buried, where they were martyred. And so it had a huge importance there. Also because of the papacy, but as you would know, having read the book, that the papacy, while it was important, didn't take on the major role in public life, in the political life of the church and of the civilized world that it would later after Gregory. Gregory is probably the most important figure in that whole span in terms of turning the papacy into what we know it to be today, in terms of the role that it played internationally. And so, yeah, but just back to your question of what the world he was living in was like, Rome was very, very diminished. There's a couple of scenes in the book that describe the palaces on the Palatine Hill, and the Circus Maximus and all that stuff were basically all in ruins already by the time Gregory was a man, by the time he was grown up. At the same time, Rome was still part of the empire. There was a war going on throughout all of Gregory's childhood called the Gothic Wars, where basically the Byzantines and the Goths kept fighting over Rome and other cities and areas in Italy. By the time Gregory was an adult, Rome was back under imperial control. And so he gets the job of city prefect, where he actually was the secular administrator of the city during his time as a young man. So as the story opens, as the story of his life opens, his childhood, they had gone through this whole like really, really horrible wars between the Byzantines and the Goths. And there wasn't much love for either side among the people of Rome. They saw themselves as Romans, but they sure did not have much of a love and an allegiance to the emperor way off in Constantinople. And so, yeah, that's kind of the stage that's set for Gregory's life, basically.
And Grabner does this kind of reconstruction of the times in a pretty vivid way,
Yes.
but also a kind of quasi-fictional, not in making up events, but in in describing the interior life of Gregory
Yes.
In a somewhat novelistic way. And I'll admit that this took me probably, I didn't like fully accept it and just like live with it until about halfway through the book. It took me a while to just like relax and accept that she was doing that, you
Yes.
know? But especially as she brings in more quotes from his letters and sermons where he's remarkably forthright about his own inner state, even in public sermons, that I started to see, well, okay, it seems like she is drawing a lot of this,
Yes.
extrapolating a lot of this from things that he actually said or wrote.
Yes. It was, as a translator, it was extremely confusing to start with because the German text doesn't actually have any footnotes about where these things are coming from. And she never actually says, or she doesn't always say, this is literally a quote from a letter and this is some dialogue that I made up. So
yes, that's true.
So that's like
wow.
The English text. Ignatius did a great job of putting actual footnotes in there, and I'm the one that actually had to go through, find out which of these things were quotations and which of them were interpolations that she made. But what's funny is that's actually not the way she did that, and I'm wondering if this is something that she's done in other books, or she probably wouldn't have to. A lot of ancient writing did the same thing. So you mentioned Plutarch's Lives, and we think of lives as like, okay, lives, but this is literally a translation of the Vita. This was a form of biography that was very popular in the ancient world. And the problem is that we have very, very few contemporary accounts of anything. That almost all lives that were written of people were written generations after the fact. And so I think the earliest life of Gregory that was written about 100 years after his death. And then there's a big one that was written in the 10th century. And there's very little other than that. I mean, it's very scant. This period, is often unfairly maligned as the Dark Ages. But one of the reasons it's called that is because just there's so much less documentary evidence and just documents than there were in earlier and in later periods. And so we have just very little to go on in terms of, third-party accounts about him. But what we do have is hundreds of letters that he wrote to various people, high and low. I mean, some of them were like, the emperor in Constantinople. Other ones are like, some monk that's living in Sicily somewhere. So, but we see all of that. And she was able to use all of that to reconstruct much of what his childhood was like, in addition to other primary sources about that period. So I think, not Polybius, get who the other, some of them were like the Gregory of Tours, history of the Franks and things like that. So sometimes they weren't even stories that were about Rome themselves, but she was able to take stuff about these other groups like the Lombards and the Franks and stuff that incidentally mentioned Rome in some of these periods and take all that together and really put together a great narrative of what Gregory's early life was like.
Well, it was interesting to read in the epilogue in the last few pages of the book, which I literally just finished 20 minutes ago. That, the first, I think it was the first biographical material we get written about Gregory is in Venerable Bede, if I'm not mistaken.
It might be, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's then him and then Paul the Deacon,
Yes.
who's a Lombard monk. But the first one is Venerable Bede, and she mentions that Gregory's memory was never forgotten. It was sort of forgotten for a while in Rome,
yeah,
and not talked about very much except for in the liturgical calendar.
Right.
And then, but it was never forgotten in England, where he had sent Augustine to evangelize the Anglo-Saxons.
Yes, I think it is. I think about 200 or 300 years after his death, that Rome does start to remember. I mean, this is why we do have other popes named Gregory, because they're naming themselves after him. But in terms of when that actually happened, but this is the thing. I mean, this is true for just about any figure in that period, that um, especially figures of the church, it usually came to be that there was a cult following for them. And then also, this is why their letters were preserved. Gregory, it was because of who he was that we still have all these letters that he wrote, because the monks were the ones that were writing down all this stuff and keeping this stuff alive. So we not only have that, but it's also his Moralia and Job, the morals or the commentary on Job. We've got several of his sermons that were written mostly, especially the ones about the Gospels. And then, of course, his dialogues, one major part of the dialogues being a life of St. Benedict. And St. Benedict was, of course, kind of a contemporary of Gregory. He died when Gregory was about maybe 10 years old or something like that. Grabner mentions Gregory hearing about Benedict as a boy. And I think this is one of those things that she speculates,
Sure.
because it would have made sense. His parents were very, very devout local Christians. In Rome, he was from a senatorial rank family, so they were a noble family. Probably relatively impoverished at that time compared to what a noble family would have been, a few hundred years prior. But they were a major stopping point for people who were traveling through Rome and stuff. So they would have stories of what was going on. He probably did hear a lot of these stories of Benedict, at least secondhand. So if he didn't meet Benedict himself, he would have certainly met people who knew Saint Benedict and were able to relate those stories to him like that.
And the other major work is the Pastoral Rule,
Yes,
correct?
yes. Which I don't know if I'd consider it. I don't know if it was written so much as a. It's funny because we think of it as, the commentary in Job is like this massive magisterial work that he put together. The Pastoral Rule is almost like something. It almost seems like something he wrote on the fly in response to all these questions he's getting from Augustine in Canterbury. And it's almost like, okay, look, Augustine, put all these things down and kind of answer all your questions with this one thing. And that has been preserved. That has been preserved as the Regula Pastoralis, the often translated as Pastoral Rule.
And this is less of a monastic rule, if I understand correctly, but in more of a guidebook for bishops, correct?
Yeah, it's sort of a guide for bishops, and especially with bishops on how to deal with the it's not so much about how to deal with the local people, but more to deal with how they were supposed to deal with the local nobility who had just recently been converted to Christianity. And so how they were supposed to, and some of the suggestions are like, I don't remember exactly what they were, but some of them are like, wow, they really had to tell people not to do this thing. And it's pretty interesting stuff.
So Gregory is kind of a born administrator. He comes from this Roman noble family, and Grabner presents him as someone from his boyhood with a very strong sense of the nobility of Roman history and the faults of Roman history,
Yes.
and somebody with a strong sense of the sort of the noblesse oblige, or the obligations of someone from a great old Roman family. And yet he, pretty early in his life, attempts to leave this kind of life behind. He develops a desire to be a monk, and he becomes a Benedictine and ultimately founds a monastery in where is the monastery? Is Sicily is where he goes first, right?
Because his parents, like pretty much all these Roman families, they had estates all over Italy, especially in Sicily. Sicily was a major agricultural region that fed Rome for the most part. And so when his father died, he inherited all these things. And because he wanted to be a monk, he ended up just giving them all to the church. So he turned some of them into monasteries. Others were used as places basically to raise food for the poor, and all that. And so, I think the first of the monasteries was in Sicily. But then his major one that he founded was basically in his parents' own home. on the Chalian Hill, right in the middle of Rome. And so that's the one where he spent most of his time. Yeah.
But he keeps getting dragged back into service, whether as a deacon in the city of Rome, as the Roman papal, I think it's Apocrisiarius, who is like
yeah.
the
It's a
papal
long Greek
nuncio.
word.
He's like the papal envoy or the papal nuncio to Constantinople for a while. He's there for several years trying to
Mm-hmm.
convince the emperor at the time to to um, to help defend Rome
Yes.
from the barbarian hordes, and uh, often sort of well, it's interesting because Gregory, and this is something that Grabner clearly isn't making up because it's there in so many of his sermons and letters. Is he's not shy for the rest of his life, pretty much, about the fact that he would rather be a monk,
Yes. Yes.
and at a certain point that he would rather be dead.
Yes.
But it's just interesting because we have so many like documented complaints by him that like it sort of goes against the grain of like what we today consider to be like the cheerful suffering of the saints,
Yeah.
not that he wasn't loving and not that he wasn't patient. He certainly was very patient. But he was not shy about like doing what he describes as groaning. He had some severe physical ailments
Yes.
that were pretty much lifelong. He was often lacking energy and just had to really work himself to the bone with all his different duties at various times. He was frustrated with the worldliness of so many people that he had to deal with,
Mm-hmm.
whether in the clergy or in politics, or even just the poor people he was trying to serve.
Mm-hmm.
And also just very frustrated at the lack of time that he had for prayer, particularly once he became the Bishop of Rome.
Yes.
So I don't know. I'm curious what impression you have of. I don't mean this as a criticism of him at all, but it's just sort of interesting to see how openly, and maybe it's mostly just in private letters to trusted confidants,
Mm-hmm.
but it seems like he's it's almost like there's a time for weeping and there's a time for celebrating, and he just recognizes, okay, I've been born into a really rough time, and I'm just gonna go with that. I'm just gonna go with that feeling. I'm
Yes.
gonna do everything I can to help. I'm not gonna waste time complaining, but I'm not gonna I'm not going to put a happy face on it either, other than in the most purely spiritual sense.
Yes,
Uh,
yes. I think it's funny because you read some of his letters and he's talking about all these things and this flowery language and all this, writing to someone, and he'll just be like, "By the way, I'm sorry I didn't get back to you sooner, but I've been in bed with severe gout for 4 days, and I haven't been able to eat anything for like a week and a half." And so it's just like, wow, this guy is really. It's not just his longing for his monastic cell. It's just literally he was in physical pain all the time, especially as he got older. But I think that's kind of the most interesting tension that the book presents is this idea that they talk about the man of action and the man of contemplation. And he wanted to be a man of contemplation, but God actually also made him to be a man of action. And what's interesting about it is it's not like, oh, he's missing what God wants him to do because he's going in the direction that God doesn't want him to. It's sort of like he was very clearly being pulled in both directions that are seemingly contradictory. And his frustration at that is very real, very honest. You see it very much in his own words, like, God, what are you doing to me? Because he kept thinking, like, okay, yeah, God wants me to do this task, but then he's put this desire in my heart, this vocation in my heart to be a monk. And when I'm done doing this thing, then I'm going to be able to go back and do what I really want to do and serve God in that way. And it never happens. He no sooner does he get set up in his monastic cell than someone's like, oh, well, we want you to go to Constantinople for years and go do this. And then he comes back. And so finally he becomes Pope, and he realizes that as much as he would want to keep up some of this monastic stuff, he can't. And then by the time he becomes Pope, he realizes, which by the way, they brought him almost literally kicking and screaming. There's a wonderful scene of people kicking down the gates, and the monks in his monastery are saying, Gregory, you need to get out there, because if you don't accept this job, I'm pretty sure they're going to come in and rip us all to pieces. And that was not an exaggeration. People, I don't know. It's hard to imagine these days, but that's how it happened often. Not just with him, but a lot of other bishops and people like that who got that job by popular acclamation. That happened quite often in those days. And so there's this hilarious scene where they just come in and they say, Gregory, if you don't go out there, we're going to throw you out, because that's it. And he knew that once he took that job, he was going to die as Pope. He was going to die as Bishop of Rome. And so that was basically it. But he was pulled in those both directions. And, it's just really interesting, because you see a lot of times you do see that where, saints or even regular Catholics of all times might be thinking God wants them to go in one direction, but he really wants them to go in another. And in this case, he's thinking God wants him to go in this one direction, and God wants him to go in another, but he still wants him to go in the other direction. And there's a real great tension that arises from that in his life. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting that he never one of the things that's interesting to me, and I'm not sure what to make of it, is that he never really lets go of that desire to be a monk, and that regret at not being able to be a monk. And I'm not sure if that's a fault or just him sort of his way of keeping before his eyes the need to remain rooted in prayer and contemplation and asceticism.
It's funny because he does never actually seem to appreciate the important role that he plays in the secular end of things, this man of action part. He almost always sees it as like, this is my lot, this is the thing that I'm stuck doing.
And he sees himself as a failure in some ways.
Yeah. And what's funny is, even though the way he sees it that way, he does a stellar job of it. I mean, he knocks out of the park. The reason why people wanted him to be Pope was just because they knew what he was like as the prefect, as the administrator, and they also trusted him. They also trusted his wisdom. They knew that he was incorruptible, in the sense that he wasn't just a political player. So he was well known in the city, and a lot of it he did not just as his this is what God wanted him to do, what God was calling him to do, but he also really had a real love for the city of Rome. And that was another thing, is he knew that's what he had to do to love his people, which was the people of Rome, basically.
Now, one thing he was able to do both in Constantinople and once he became the Bishop of Rome was to sort of bring the monastery with him to some extent. In other words, to sort of make his he actually brought some monks with him to Constantinople to continue to live an ascetic life.
Yes.
And he, as Pope, he brings monks with him to be assistants of various kinds. There's other monks who are also serving important positions in the city as well. And also in Constantinople in particular, he makes a number of very close friends.
Yes.
Among them, Leander, who is the brother of the last of the Western Church Fathers, Saint Isidore of Seville, and then a number of pious women, including the wife and sister of the future emperor, Byzantine emperor, and or I should say Roman emperor, and it seems that aside from God, his great consolation in life was his friendships.
Yes.
And so that was something that I felt very able to relate to in this book.
And what's interesting is his friendships. He's close to Leander, but his close friends are not only monastics, and that's what I think is very interesting as well, because he was certainly, his monastic life was everything to him, But there were a lot of lay people who he was very close to. You mentioned in particular Theoctista was the sister of the Emperor Maurice, and his wife. Her name's actually eluding me now. He was actually closer to the sister, but both of them he was extremely close to. Um, and yeah, that was the thing. I'm trying to think of who else. There were some other guys who were just prefects. There was another guy who was the master of the master militum, who was the captain of the military in certain areas. And he did.
Narcisse?
Narcisse was the governor, but that was when he was younger. Narcisse died when he
Right.
was a young man, basically. But I think much of the relationship between him and Narcisse is speculated by Grabner and not so much based on his writings. Mostly was based on, there's a lot of other sources on who Narcisse was. Famously, he was a eunuch who was somehow, he was basically a civilian who was a eunuch who late in life Justinian sends him over basically as a general, and he's like 80 years old, and he somehow ends up being this amazing general in the field. And in his 70s, he wasn't 80 yet, but then he ends up being responsible for winning. Narcisse is the one who basically was responsible for winning Italy back to the empire. Um, yeah, and he would have known Gregory because he was the imperial governor at the time when Gregory was prefect, I believe.
Okay, so I wanted to read a passage from one of his sermons here. It's on page 189 in the book. It's a little bit long, but
Sure.
it was the most striking passage to me, and it brings together. Well, what's striking to me is that this is a public sermon he's giving. It's from one of his homilies on Ezekiel, and he's incredibly just forthright about his own faults in a way that you really wouldn't expect to see from a pope, and perhaps wouldn't see at a time when a pope is more of a public figure in a sense than he was back then. But okay, so I often become lost in idle chatter, and in my carelessness and laziness neglect to provide my fellow men with admonishment and edification. Indeed, when I was still in the monastery, I was able to restrain my tongue from engaging in useless talk, maintaining my spirit in an almost uninterrupted state of prayer. But since taking upon the shoulders of my heart the burden of pastoral care, my soul is not always able to collect itself because it is divided amongst so many cares. I find myself compelled to arbitrate disputes, sometimes those between churches, sometimes those between monasteries, and I must often attend to the circumstances and activities of individuals. At other times, I am preoccupied with the concerns of the citizens, the horrors of the descending swords of the barbarians, the fear of the wolves that stalk the flock entrusted to me. And then I have to see to it that those who maintain public order are not lacking in the support they need. I must endure looters with equanimity or confront them with the love that is commanded of me. Because my office often requires me to deal with men of the world, I sometimes loosen the reins of my tongue. I know that if I devote myself to my official duties with the zeal expected of me, then I will elude these weaker men and never get them to do what I have in mind. Thus, it often happens that I listen to their idle talk with patience, and since I am a weak man myself, I end up being drawn into useless conversations before I notice it, and I begin to enjoy saying what I initially listened to with reluctance, and where I was previously disgusted by the situation, I find I am not at all unwilling to participate myself. What kind of a watchman am I who stand not atop the mountain of right action, but lie yet in the pit of weakness? It's just a really remarkable passage, and what it says, the detail he goes into about how he gets drawn into vain talk, which is something that the rest of us hardly think at all
Yeah,
about, but
yeah.
very important for a Benedictine.
Yeah, and I think it's funny because I'm just imagining the situation of, a bishop giving a sermon at mass, and he's just going on about how he just can't handle, like, especially the part where he talks about how if he really acted with the zeal he felt like he had to, these lesser men wouldn't be able to keep up. And I thought that was pretty fascinating too, probably for the same reasons you did, that to think someone just going off like that. But at the same time, it's some of it seems almost trivial to us as, lay people in a very different state of life and in a very different time. But yeah, he was, a hardcore Benedictine, who he wanted to be completely focused on prayer at all times. And that standard that he tried to hold himself to was just very, very difficult for the other needs of his vocation, basically, or the other requirements of his vocation.
And yet he was a gregarious person,
Yes.
pun intended, who liked to talk with people. He was someone naturally disposed towards friendship. And so you almost see that even in his homily. It's almost like he's like chatting with his, his people in the church as though they're just close friends or something.
Yes. And I think some of it, sometimes you look at what a lot of it's, we have to remember sometimes that the culture that a lot of those guys lived in around that time is just very alien to us to kind of understand. Famously in the Benedictine rule, Benedict basically says that monks should never laugh, and it's like, well, how is that even human? I think some of it is just hard for us to. They were just looking at things so differently, but at the same time, you do see a lot of Gregory's humanity. And that's one of the things I loved about this book, because when you actually read some of the things that are said by people, a lot of the church fathers and stuff like that, you're like, geez, are these people like superhuman, or do they not have, the same wants and needs that we do? And you do see that there's a lot of humanity. There's a lot of common humanity that just seems to be missed when you're only reading that what's been left in the literary record, I guess. And you see it in his writings, just how he really, really loves, speaking to his friends, and just the depth of friendship, especially friendships that are based around a common love of God and everything like that. And I found that the book humanizes him in that's kind of like, you could overdo that to such a degree where you want to. I don't mean in a sense of like deconstructing anything. And I guess you could say that it humanizes him without actually deconstructing the holiness and the otherworldliness that he really represented.
Yeah, that's right. And when you put it like that, it's a real achievement on the author's part, I think. So I'm curious, do you think that Gregory is called the Great more for his writings or more for his status as a defender of the people of Rome at that time?
The historical answer, probably because of his writings, is that's probably why the name was originally applied. But I'm not 100% sure on that. And the truth is that it actually works both ways. That I can't really necessarily answer why he was called the Great, or I don't even really quite remember when that appellation first came up. Because it's usually those names like that don't happen until long after someone's gone. But I do think in either way that the name is apt. Just that you mentioned before that you can't imagine a pope, especially at that time, making that kind of sermon or doing that kind of sermon. But one thing that I found very interesting is that this is before the imperial papacy. This is before the papacy of the Middle Ages, where the Pope had that clout, or that yeah, I think he saw himself more as the Bishop of Rome than anything, I guess is what I'm getting at, rather than as like the universal pontiff of the church. And he was that, and he saw himself as that. But I think he saw his primary role as being the bishop and the defender of Rome. And he's the one that basically laid the groundwork for the papacy ultimately taking the role that it did throughout history as we know it. That he kept it independent of political control. I think that's a major theme of the book, is that he's never quite subject to the emperor, and there are many times where he basically goes against the wishes of the emperor um, in the book, negotiating with the Lombards himself, and doing all those kinds of things. I think was something that and basically ultimately ensuring that the Lombards never did take Rome. They took all of northern Italy, which is why we call it Lombardy today. But his role in keeping Rome independent from the political powers of his day and the military powers of his day is something that is pretty amazing. But then also he's a father of the church. He's one of the original four doctors of the church as well. Um, so he's really got an earth-shattering position, no matter which way you slice it, I guess.
Well, let's talk a bit about his duties in the city of Rome, particularly. And it would seem that he was, he had to oversee all kinds of secular matters as pope as well, because Rome was in such a dire state and there was such a lack of leadership. So, I mean, this really covers a lot. But could you give an overview of all the things that he basically had to do for the people of Rome?
Yeah, so like I had mentioned before, Rome was in a very sorry state at that time. A lot of the aqueducts of the city had been cut. There was just a lot of stuff going on that had fallen apart from where it had been. They mentioned him going out and helping reconstruct the walls where they had been broken, where they've been breached. A major thing a lot of people don't get is that Rome, I mentioned before that Rome was a massive city for its time in history. Because we don't often think of the logistical problem of like feeding that many people in one place. And it's true that in the high imperial period of Rome, something like the poor people basically had to depend on grain subsidies from the state. I mean, they didn't work the fields themselves. There was no other way to feed all this people in this urban environment without the state actually stepping in and giving away grain, basically. And that whole system had fallen apart by the time he was there. So they're like, it's almost entirely due to his efforts as prefect and then later as bishop that a lot of people even were able to eat. Um, he had to ensure that there were enough shipments into the city at a time when the shipping routes were completely full of pirates. The roads were no longer safe. Just basically ensuring that people were actually able to eat. That and he definitely saw that as his duty. And so when he actually became a monk, that was another thing that after I think it was after his father died, he and his mother basically started to host people at their house. That they would just have people over at this estate and feed them at the table. Almost every night they would have people over. The city's poor and stuff like that. And then when he actually got into that position of power, and especially when he was bishop of Rome, it was his duty to basically keep the city fed and supplied. It was basically all on him.
Gregory is pretty famous for dealing with barbarian attackers. And so can you tell us about some of the most important moments throughout his life, whether from before he was pope or during his papacy, when he was figuring out how to defend Rome from being completely destroyed, basically?
Yeah. So basically, the big one was the Lombards who had come in. So you had all the fighting between the Goths and the Eastern Romans over Rome. And what ended up happening was both sides kind of weakened each other. And then there were two new players that had come in. One were the Franks who had been Christianized, and there were the Goths who were already I mean, they were still pagan. They ultimately did convert, but they were still pagan at the time of when Gregory deals with them. And so his whole problem was, in fact, that's why he was sent to Constantinople, was to try to get the emperor to care about Rome. And it just was not on the emperor's radar at the time. The big problem for Rome was that they had been fighting the Persians for forever at the time, and so
For Constantinople, you mean?
yes, yeah, from
Before the Roman
Constantinople,
Empire as a whole.
and there was the Persian Empire, and they were locked in a bitter struggle for decades and decades. And actually, the whole thing fell apart a couple of decades after Gregory died. Was when um, the Persians conquered all of Eastern Rome. Rome wins it all back, including Jerusalem, all this. And then very shortly after that is when Islam happens. And you've got the Arabs just burst out from the desert. And there's very little standing in their way because nobody was expecting anything like that. And both the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire were overrun. And that's when Rome ultimately loses all those eastern territories. So, the Levant and Egypt and everything like that were lost basically forever at that point. But at Gregory's time, it was the fact that the emperor was focused on the east and nobody really cared about what was going on in Rome. I mean, it's not that they didn't care; it's just that they didn't have more guys to send or anything to do. And so he basically had to navigate that. And one of the things he ultimately did was leveraging the Franks against the Lombards. And this is the beginning of that whole contentious issue where France was the protector of the papacy, kind of going back to that point. Now, sometimes they were the ones that bullied the papacy around as well. But that whole premise, that whole idea that the French were the ones who were going to defend the Pope, that also starts with Gregory.
Gregory also kind of does a reprise of Leo the Great's famous action of going outside the walls of the city and fending off barbarian invaders. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, we actually don't know what Leo the Great did. We know he went out there and talked to Attila, and the actual content is rather spotty, but we do know that Gregory did something very similar with Agilulf, I think was the Lombard king at the time. And I mean, he basically worked. I'm trying to remember. It's been a while since I actually read that part of the book. But it was his efforts to basically convince Agilulf to leave Rome alone. And the Lombards did end up taking some areas that were south of Rome and pretty much everything that was north of it. They displaced the Ostrogoths in Ravenna, but that was Gregory. It's basically the fact that if you look at the history of Italy through the next several centuries, Rome is kind of its own little thing in the middle of what was ever going on to the north and to the south. He's basically the reason, or his actions are basically the reason why Italy was never, from that point, they were never fully conquered by any one power. And so you see that even today in the modern state of Italy, I mean, you have a lot of historic divisions between north and south, and a lot of that comes from the fact that he was right there in the middle. And that original, what ended up becoming the Papal States, were left independent because of him.
So Gregory was sort of left on his own to an extent, or even interfered with, because he was trying to make peace with the Lombards, understanding that they had been driven out of their own lands and were trying to find somewhere to settle. Of course, they were aggressors against innocent people, but he was trying to understand their motivations and speak to it, and preserve safety for the innocents under his charge. Unfortunately, the Byzantine, now I don't know what an exarch is exactly. The Byzantine exarch in Ravenna. What was that?
Was it Romanus, I think is his name?
I think so. He did not have the same idea, and Gregory had the problem with, which was that if he were to make peace with, with the Lombards, it could be perceived as disloyal to the
Yes.
empire, and also the empire wouldn't necessarily stand by that peace. So Gregory could really only speak for the city of Rome, but he couldn't
Yes.
say Romanus is not going to attack you anymore. And so he basically just has to go out on his own, and he walks outside the city and talks to two different Lombard leaders. One of them is it Agiolf, something
Yeah,
like
there's a guy
that?
named like Agiolf and another guy named like Agilulf, I
Lolf.
think. So there's yeah, it's really confusing when you get to what all these different Lombard leaders that are there. But yes, that was the thing is he had to because the Byzantines were basically like, look, we don't really necessarily care as much if they take Rome. We're worried about defending Ravenna, and we don't want to, give them. We don't want to make peace with them. We want to actually, get rid of them. And Gregory knew that if that were to happen, Rome was going to be caught. They were going to be the ones that were going to be ground up in the crossfire there. That's what had happened in the whole Gothic War with the Eastern Romans and the Goths fighting each other, and everybody marching in and out of Rome over all that period. So yeah, he basically, when he does that, it's an effective declaration of independence of Rome from Rome. It, it's basically effectively when the city of Rome departs from the Roman Empire, if that makes much sense. We're using a lot of the same words to describe different things, but yeah.
Uh-huh.
And it was seen
Yeah.
as
So
disloyal. It was seen as him stepping out of line, but there was really nothing anybody could do either. It's not like the Constantinople actually could. And this is what was in his calculus, is that they can't really project power to make him do anything, but they also can't project power to protect him if they do what he says. I mean, if he does what they
right.
want him to do, and so that's why he kind of had to step out on his own and do his own thing.
So you said this was your first major translation commission.
Yes.
Well, you did a great job. Do you have any others coming up?
I do. We have also from Ignatius. I'm translating it's a series of lectures that were given by well, he wasn't Pope Benedict at the time, but Joseph Ratzinger in the mid '80s. They basically about 10 years ago, when he was Pope, they discovered a cache of tapes of some lectures he gave about the issue of creation and the nature of the church. And so I'm doing that as well right now. I can say that Dr. Sigurd Grabner's prose is a lot easier to translate than Joseph Ratzinger's unedited speaking academic lectures. But yeah, that's the other thing I'm working on right now as well.
Oh, great. And is German your main thing then?
Yeah, German is my translation language. I lived there. I taught English there about 10 years ago. And while I was there, I started picking up little minor jobs here and there, translating things. And so it's only a few years ago that I actually kind of made the switch into literary translation.
Hmm.
And this was my first major thing working in literary translation. It's a lot of fun.
And thank you, Chase, for coming on the podcast. I do recommend that people check out this book. I got a lot out of it. I think that it filled in a real gap for me in church history and in Western history.
Yes.
It's a period that's easily neglected, obviously. So I think it's worth checking out. And it's a real portrait of Christian leadership, both in the secular world and in the ecclesiastical realm. So thanks for coming on, Chase.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Thomas, and God bless you. Thank you.
All right, everybody who's listening, if you're watching on YouTube, please do subscribe to our channel. If you'd like to help us out, you can go to catholicculture.org/donate/audio, and your donation will be earmarked specifically for our podcast productions. If not, please do keep us in our prayers. We pray for our listeners as well as our donors every day. And also do consider, we were talking about a father and doctor of the church here. Do consider checking out some of our other podcasts, which focus more on that sort of thing. So we have Way of the Fathers with Mike Aquilina, where he's just finished his first season, where he did profiles of all of the fathers of the church in about 56 episodes. He's now doing topical episodes in church history, but will be soon returning for a second season on the ecumenical councils. And then we also have Catholic Culture audiobooks. We were mentioning Gregory's dialogues, and in fact, this summer, James will be recording a 9-episode series on St. Benedict. So he'll be recording both the Rule of St. Benedict and Gregory's Life and Miracles of St. Benedict, which forms book 3 of the dialogue.